London, 1942. While American forces were preparing to join the fight in Europe and the Pacific, deep inside a nondescript brick building near the Thames River, a British intelligence officer named Charles Fraser Smith was stuffing explosives into the corpse of a dead rat. This wasn't madness. This wasn't some twisted experiment gone wrong. This was Operation Rat Bomb, one of the most bizarre and ingenious sabotage schemes ever conceived by the Special Operations Executive, the shadowy organization Winston Churchill created with a single mandate: set Europe ablaze. The genius behind this weapon wasn't just its disguise, it was psychological warfare at its most diabolical. German factory workers, terrified of disease and contamination, would discover these dead rats near their coal supplies and immediately throw them into the furnaces to incinerate the vermin. What they didn't know was that each rat contained enough plastic explosive to turn a factory boiler into a pressure cooker of death, sending shrapnel and superheated steam through industrial complexes that kept the Nazi war machine running. The beauty of the plan was in its inevitability. You didn't need a spy to plant the bomb. You just needed a German worker doing exactly what he was trained to do: maintain hygiene and destroy pests. Charles Fraser Smith wasn't your typical spy. He wasn't parachuting behind enemy lines or seducing Nazi officers at cocktail parties. He was something far more dangerous, an inventor working in the shadows, creating the tools that would allow ordinary men and women to become instruments of chaos across occupied Europe. Before the war, Fraser Smith had been a missionary in Morocco, which gave him an unusual understanding of how people think, what they fear, and how small disruptions can create cascading failures in complex systems. When British intelligence recruited him in 1939, they didn't want another soldier. They wanted someone who could think like a toy maker, a prankster, and an assassin all at once. His workshop became a fever dream of lethal creativity. Compasses hidden in buttons, maps printed on silk handkerchiefs, briefcases with false bottoms containing everything from suicide pills to miniature cameras. But the exploding rats represented something different. They weren't tools for spies. They were weapons that turned the enemy's own instincts against them, a Trojan horse made of fur and bone. The winter of 1941 had been brutal for British intelligence. The Blitz had killed over 40,000 civilians in London alone. British factories were working around the clock to replace destroyed infrastructure, while simultaneously trying to build enough planes, tanks and ships to challenge Nazi Germany's industrial supremacy. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, German factories in occupied France, Belgium and the Netherlands were operating at full capacity, churning out the Messerschmitt fighters that bombed British cities and the U-boats that strangled supply convoys in the Atlantic. Traditional bombing raids were costly and imprecise. Sending saboteurs into occupied territory was even more dangerous, with captured agents facing torture and execution. The Special Operations Executive needed a new approach, something that required minimal risk to British personnel, but maximum disruption to German industry. The answer came from an unlikely source, a conversation about rats in coal piles and the German obsession with industrial cleanliness. The concept was deceptively simple, but required meticulous execution. Fraser Smith's team began acquiring dead rats, approximately 100 specimens in the first batch, each roughly the size of a small book. The rats were carefully skinned, their internal organs removed and replaced with moldable plastic explosive developed by British chemists specifically for covert operations. The explosive was stable enough to survive rough handling, but sensitive enough to detonate when exposed to the intense heat of an industrial furnace. Each rat was then sewn back together with surgical precision, the stitching hidden beneath the fur so that even close inspection wouldn't reveal the modification. The final product looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a dead rat that had crawled into a coal pile and expired, something so mundane that it would trigger an automatic response in anyone who discovered it. Throw it in the fire, burn it, get rid of it. And in that single, thoughtless action, a German factory worker would become an unwitting saboteur for the British Crown. The first challenge was distribution. How do you get 100 exploding rats into Nazi-occupied Europe without arousing suspicion? The Special Operations Executive had established networks of resistance fighters and sympathizers across the continent, but smuggling weapons and radio equipment was already dangerous enough. Asking operatives to transport sacks of dead rodents seemed absurd, even by the standards of covert warfare. The solution involved merchant sailors, fishing boats and clandestine drops along the French and Belgian coasts. Resistance cells were instructed to place the rats in strategic locations, near coal supplies at railway depots, adjacent to fuel storage facilities, inside warehouses that serviced German military installations. The rats didn't need to be hidden. In fact, they worked better when they were visible, lying on top of coal piles or near furnace doors where workers would immediately spot them and dispose of them in the most obvious way possible. The entire operation relied on human nature, on the predictable revulsion people feel toward dead vermin, and their instinct to eliminate any potential source of contamination. What Fraser Smith and his team at the Special Operations Executive couldn't have predicted was how the psychological impact of Operation Rat Bomb would far exceed its physical damage. When the first explosions occurred in German factories during the spring of 1942, Nazi security officials were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of saboteurs, no suspicious activity reported by guards or informants. The boiler explosions appeared random, scattered across different facilities with no discernible pattern. It took German intelligence several weeks to discover one of the unexploded rats and realize what they were dealing with. The discovery triggered something close to paranoia. Suddenly, every dead rat in every German-controlled factory became a potential bomb. Workers were instructed to report any dead rodents immediately and under no circumstances dispose of them without clearance from security personnel. Entire facilities were shut down for inspections. Coal supplies were examined piece by piece. The German war machine, which prided itself on efficiency and precision, ground to a halt over the fear of exploding vermin. The irony wasn't lost on British intelligence officers monitoring the operation's results through decoded German communications and reports from resistance networks. The actual number of successful rat bomb explosions was relatively small, perhaps a dozen confirmed detonations across occupied Europe during the spring and summer of 1942. Several rats had been discovered before reaching their targets. Others failed to detonate due to moisture damage or improper placement. A few exploded prematurely during transport, killing no one but creating spectacular confusion among German security forces trying to understand what kind of new weapon they were facing. But the real success of Operation Rat Bomb wasn't measured in destroyed boilers or casualties. It was measured in the thousands of man-hours German personnel wasted inspecting coal piles, the production delays caused by security protocols, and the creeping sense of vulnerability that spread through the industrial workforce. Every factory worker now looked at ordinary vermin with suspicion. Every dead rat became a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. Charles Fraser Smith had stumbled onto something profound about the nature of psychological warfare. Traditional sabotage relied on stealth and surprise. Plant a bomb, escape before it detonates, inflict maximum damage. But that approach required constant infiltration of enemy territory, constant risk to operatives, and diminishing returns as security measures improved. The exploding rats represented a different philosophy entirely. They weaponized routine behavior and natural human responses. They didn't require ongoing operations or sophisticated intelligence. Once the initial batch was distributed and the first explosions occurred, the weapon became self-perpetuating through German paranoia. Nazi security officials did the rest of the work, creating elaborate procedures and protocols that disrupted their own industrial capacity far more effectively than 100 saboteurs could have achieved. It was asymmetric warfare at its most elegant. Minimal British investment for maximum German disruption. The German response escalated throughout 1942. Heinrich Himmler's security apparatus issued directives requiring all industrial facilities to implement comprehensive vermin control programs. Dead rats couldn't simply be burned anymore. They had to be reported, catalogued, examined by trained personnel, and disposed of according to strict protocols. Some facilities built special incinerators specifically for suspicious animal carcasses. Others created quarantine areas where dead rodents were stored until explosives experts could examine them. The Reich Security Main Office distributed photographs and detailed descriptions of the exploding rats to every factory, rail depot, and military installation across occupied Europe. Workers received training on how to identify potential rat bombs, what to look for in terms of stitching or unusual weight, how to handle suspected devices. The entire infrastructure of Nazi Germany's industrial complex was now spending significant resources managing a threat that consisted of perhaps 100 modified rodent corpses, most of which had already been discovered or destroyed. What made the psychological impact even more devastating was the uncertainty. German intelligence never determined exactly how many exploding rats had been distributed. They found some intact specimens, they documented some explosions, but they had no way of knowing whether there were 10 more waiting to be discovered or 10,000. British intelligence, naturally, did nothing to clarify the situation. In fact, they actively encouraged German paranoia by occasionally having resistance operatives plant ordinary dead rats in strategic locations just to trigger security responses and waste more German time and resources. The Special Operations Executive also leaked false information through compromised channels, suggesting that the rat bombs were just the beginning, that British scientists had developed exploding coal, contaminated lubricants, and time-delayed chemical agents hidden in industrial supplies. None of these other weapons existed, but German security forces had to treat every claim as credible, which meant more inspections, more delays, more disruption to the production schedules that kept Wehrmacht divisions supplied and Luftwaffe squadrons flying. By the autumn of 1942, Operation Rat Bomb had achieved something remarkable. With minimal expenditure and almost no risk to British personnel, Fraser Smith's bizarre invention had forced Nazi Germany to divert substantial resources away from actual military production toward phantom security threats. Factory managers across occupied Europe were now terrified of vermin. Coal supplies that used to be loaded directly into furnaces now required multi-stage inspection processes. Workers who previously focused on manufacturing weapons and ammunition were now spending hours examining dead animals and filing security reports. The operation's true genius lay in its sustainability. Even after the threat had largely passed, even after most of the original rat bombs had been found or destroyed, the fear remained. German industrial workers would continue looking at dead rats with suspicion for the remainder of the war, a small but persistent tax on efficiency that accumulated across thousands of facilities and millions of work hours. Charles Fraser Smith had done something Sun Tzu would have appreciated. He had made the enemy defeat themselves. Charles Fraser Smith never sought recognition for his work. While codebreakers at Bletchley Park would eventually receive public acknowledgement for cracking the Enigma machine, and while commando raids like the attack on Saint-Nazaire would be celebrated in newspapers and history books, the inventors and engineers of the Special Operations Executive worked in deliberate obscurity. Fraser Smith's workshop on Aylesbury Street in London operated without official designation, without signage, without any indication that inside its walls some of the war's most creative and lethal minds were solving problems that conventional military thinking couldn't address. The exploding rats were just one project, among dozens that Fraser Smith managed during the war years. He developed fountain pens that concealed maps, shoelaces that could be burned to produce thick smoke screens, playing cards that separated into escape maps when soaked in water, but the rats represented his purest achievement in psychological warfare, a weapon that required almost no maintenance, no training, no ongoing operations, yet continued delivering results long after deployment. The success of Operation Rat Bomb inspired similar projects throughout 1943 and 1944. British intelligence developed exploding coal, genuine chunks of anthracite that had been hollowed out, filled with plastic explosive, and then sealed with a mixture of coal dust and adhesive that made them virtually indistinguishable from ordinary fuel. These were distributed through resistance networks in France and Belgium, placed in coal yards and railway depots where German locomotives refueled. The psychological template was identical. Make the weapon look like something the enemy would use in their normal routine, then let their own actions trigger the destruction. Several German trains experienced catastrophic boiler explosions when the disguised coal was shoveled into their fireboxes, and once again, Nazi security forces found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. How many pieces of exploding coal existed? Which supplies were contaminated? Every coal delivery now required inspection. Every fuel source became suspect. The cascading effect on German logistics was exactly what Churchill had demanded when he created the Special Operations Executive. Maximum chaos from minimum investment. Fraser Smith's approach to sabotage reflected a deeper understanding of how modern industrial societies function. Traditional military targeting focused on obvious infrastructure, bridges, railways, factories, power stations. Destroy these nodes and you disrupt enemy capability. But Fraser Smith recognized that industrial production depends equally on confidence and routine. Workers need to trust their materials. Managers need to rely on established procedures. The moment that trust evaporates, the moment workers start questioning whether the coal they're shoveling might explode or the rats they're disposing of might be bombs, the entire system slows down. Fear becomes friction. Paranoia becomes paralysis. And unlike a destroyed bridge that can be rebuilt or a bombed factory that can be repaired, psychological damage is harder to fix. You can't simply reconstruct confidence or engineer away suspicion. Once German industrial workers learned that ordinary objects could be weapons, that lesson couldn't be unlearned. It stayed with them, influencing their behavior, slowing their work, creating inefficiencies that accumulated across the entire industrial base. The German response to these British innovations revealed both the strength and weakness of Nazi administrative culture. On one hand, the Germans were methodical and thorough in their attempts to counter the threat. They developed comprehensive inspection protocols, trained specialists in identifying sabotage devices, created detailed documentation systems for tracking suspicious materials. Their engineers studied captured examples of exploding rats and coal, reverse engineering the British techniques to understand how they worked. Security services interviewed factory workers, trying to identify patterns in when and where the devices appeared, hoping to trace them back to resistance networks. In many ways, the German response was exactly what competent security forces should do when facing an unconventional threat. But that thoroughness came at a cost. Every inspection took time. Every protocol added steps to previously streamlined processes. Every security measure created bottlenecks. The Nazi industrial machine was incredibly efficient when operating normally, but it lacked flexibility when dealing with asymmetric threats. It couldn't easily adapt to a situation where the threat was both everywhere and nowhere, both minimal and catastrophic. By mid-1943, British intelligence analysts reviewing decoded German communications noted a subtle but significant shift in industrial output from occupied territories. Production numbers weren't collapsing, but they weren't meeting projections either. German factories that should have been manufacturing specific quantities of ammunition, vehicle parts and aircraft components were consistently falling short by small margins, typically between 5 and 15% below targets. When Nazi officials investigated these shortfalls, they found no single cause, no dramatic sabotage events, no major equipment failures. Instead, they discovered 1,000 small delays, security inspections that took longer than scheduled, workers who moved more cautiously around materials, managers who implemented additional verification steps to avoid potential disasters. The exploding rats and their successor weapons hadn't destroyed German industrial capacity. They had simply made it slower, more paranoid, more inefficient. And in total war, where victory often depends on which side can produce more weapons faster, even small inefficiencies compound into strategic disadvantages. The peculiar genius of Fraser Smith's wartime career became clearer when examining his background before British intelligence recruited him. During his years as a missionary in Morocco throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Fraser Smith had learned something crucial about human psychology that most military strategists overlooked. People are far more motivated by fear of the unfamiliar than by actual danger. A Moroccan villager might handle venomous snakes with casual indifference, because snakes were predictable, understood, part of the natural order. But introduce something that violated expectations, something that looked harmless but proved deadly, and that same villager would become paralyzed with caution. Fraser Smith carried this insight back to England when he returned in 1935 to work in his family's business manufacturing fountain pens and office supplies. When war broke out, and British intelligence came looking for creative minds who understood both engineering and psychology, Fraser Smith's unique combination of missionary experience and manufacturing expertise made him an ideal candidate for the kind of unconventional warfare Churchill envisioned. The Special Operations Executive assigned Fraser Smith to work directly with agents preparing for insertion into occupied Europe, and this hands-on collaboration shaped his approach to weapon design. Traditional military equipment was built for soldiers, durable, powerful, obvious in its lethality. But SOE agents weren't soldiers in the conventional sense. They were civilians pretending to be civilians, trying to blend into occupied populations while conducting sabotage operations. They needed tools that looked innocuous, that could pass inspection by German security forces, that wouldn't betray their true purpose even under close examination. Fraser Smith's workshop became a laboratory for deception. He developed cigarette lighters that concealed miniature cameras, chess sets where the pieces unscrewed to reveal hidden compartments, briefcases with false bottoms so cunningly constructed that even experienced German counterintelligence officers often failed to detect them. Every device had to pass what Fraser Smith called the plausibility test. If a German soldier picked it up and examined it, would anything seem wrong? Would the weight feel off? Would the construction appear suspicious? If the answer was yes, Fraser Smith went back to the drawing board. The exploding rats emerged from this design philosophy. Fraser Smith needed a sabotage weapon that required minimal training, minimal risk during transport, and minimal chance of being identified as a weapon before deployment. The breakthrough came during a staff meeting in late 1941, when someone mentioned that German factory managers were fanatic about cleanliness and pest control, often conducting surprise inspections to ensure workers maintained proper hygiene standards. Fraser Smith immediately recognized the opportunity. If German industrial culture already treated dead vermin as contamination hazards requiring immediate disposal, then dead vermin became the perfect disguise for an explosive device. The genius wasn't in the explosive itself, which was relatively standard plastic explosive, similar to what SOE used in dozens of other applications. The genius was in understanding that the weapon didn't need stealth or sophistication. It just needed to look exactly like something the enemy would want to destroy, then let the enemy destroy themselves. Preparing the first batch of rat bombs required solving several technical challenges that wouldn't have occurred to conventional weapons designers. The rats had to be recently dead but not decomposed, which meant Fraser Smith's team had to establish relationships with pest control companies and research laboratories that regularly disposed of rat specimens. The skinning and reassembly process had to be done carefully enough that the final product looked natural, not like a taxidermy experiment. The explosive filling couldn't be too heavy, or the rat would feel suspiciously dense if someone picked it up before disposal. The stitching had to be hidden beneath the fur and positioned along natural seams in the skin where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Most critically, the explosive had to be stable enough to survive rough handling during transport across the English Channel and distribution through resistance networks, but sensitive enough to detonate reliably when exposed to furnace temperatures. Fraser Smith worked with British chemists to develop a plastic explosive mixture that met these exact specifications, a formulation that existed nowhere else in the Allied arsenal, because no other weapon required these particular characteristics. The selection of target facilities for the rat bombs revealed Fraser Smith's strategic thinking beyond simple sabotage. He wasn't trying to destroy German industrial capacity outright, which would have required thousands of bombs and massive ongoing operations. Instead, he aimed to inject uncertainty into the German logistics network at specific pressure points. Railway depots were prime targets because a single boiler explosion could disable a locomotive for weeks and create cascading delays across an entire regional rail system. Factory heating systems were targeted, because winter production in occupied Europe depended on maintaining adequate temperatures in manufacturing facilities, and a destroyed boiler could shut down an entire plant until replacement parts arrived. Military installations that relied on coal-fired generators for electricity became targets because power disruptions would interrupt communications, radar operations, and administrative functions. Each rat bomb was a small investment, but deployed strategically, they created disproportionate disruption, and once German security forces discovered what they were dealing with, the paranoia multiplied the effect far beyond the actual number of devices in circulation. The distribution network for Operation Rat Bomb required careful coordination between multiple branches of British intelligence and resistance organizations across occupied Europe. The Special Operations Executive couldn't simply airdrop sacks of exploding rats over France and hope for the best. Each device needed to reach specific types of facilities where coal-burning equipment was central to operations, and placement had to appear natural rather than suspicious. SOE liaisons in London worked with Free French intelligence officers and Belgian resistance coordinators to identify trusted operatives who could handle the unusual cargo without asking too many questions or compromising security through careless talk. The rats were packaged in waterproof containers, disguised as medical supplies or industrial materials, shipped across the channel on fishing boats and small cargo vessels that regularly made clandestine runs between British ports and occupied coastlines. Once the containers reached resistance cells in France and Belgium, local operatives received coded instructions about where to deploy them: near coal piles at specific railway stations, inside warehouses that serviced German military logistics, adjacent to factory complexes that manufactured components for Wehrmacht vehicles. The human element of the operation was perhaps its most remarkable aspect. Resistance fighters who were already risking execution for hiding Allied pilots or transmitting intelligence reports now found themselves carrying sacks of dead rats through German checkpoints and patrol zones. The absurdity of the mission didn't diminish its danger. If German soldiers discovered the rats and examined them closely enough to find the explosives, the operatives carrying them would face immediate arrest, torture for information about their networks, and execution. Yet the resistance members assigned to rat bomb distribution approached the task with the same deadly seriousness they brought to every SOE operation. They understood that unconventional weapons often proved more effective than conventional ones, precisely because they exploited enemy blind spots. A German patrol searching a suspect for weapons would look for pistols, grenades, radio equipment, and documents. They wouldn't necessarily examine a sack that appeared to contain pest control specimens or laboratory research materials. The rats succeeded partly because they were so bizarre that German security forces hadn't imagined them as a threat category. The first confirmed rat bomb explosion occurred in early March of 1942 at a railway depot outside Lille in northern France. A German maintenance worker discovered what appeared to be a dead rat near a coal pile used to fuel locomotives. Following standard hygiene protocols, he picked up the rat with a shovel and tossed it into the firebox of a locomotive that was being prepared for departure. 20 minutes later, as the locomotive built up steam pressure, the plastic explosive inside the rat reached its detonation temperature. The resulting explosion didn't just destroy the boiler. It sent metal fragments through the locomotive cab, killed the engineer who was conducting final inspections, and started a coal fire that spread to adjacent fuel supplies. The depot shut down for 3 days, while German authorities investigated what they initially assumed was a catastrophic equipment failure. Only when similar explosions occurred at other facilities over the following weeks did German intelligence begin connecting the incidents and searching for a common cause. The discovery of an intact rat bomb in April 1942 changed everything. A German security officer at a Belgian factory noticed something odd about a dead rat found near the facility's main boiler. The stitching along its abdomen appeared too neat, too surgical. Instead of disposing of it immediately, he requisitioned a bomb disposal specialist to examine the specimen. When they carefully opened the rat, they found nearly 1/4 pound of plastic explosive packed inside the body cavity. The discovery triggered an immediate alert across all German-controlled industrial facilities. Photographs of the device were distributed with urgent warnings. Workers received instructions to report any dead vermin immediately, and under no circumstances attempt disposal without clearance from security personnel. The German counterintelligence apparatus, which had been struggling to understand the pattern of mysterious boiler explosions, suddenly had their answer. But having the answer didn't solve their problem. Now they knew what to look for, but they had no idea how many more exploding rats were already in circulation, waiting to be discovered. The psychological warfare aspect of Operation Rat Bomb reached its apex in the months following the discovery. German security services found themselves in an impossible position. They had identified the threat, but they couldn't eliminate it without shutting down industrial operations to conduct comprehensive searches of every coal pile, every fuel depot, every storage area in occupied Europe. Even if they conducted such searches, they couldn't guarantee finding every rat bomb. British intelligence might have distributed dozens or hundreds or thousands. The uncertainty paralyzed decision-making at multiple levels of the Nazi administrative hierarchy. Factory managers didn't want to be responsible for an explosion that killed workers and destroyed equipment, so they implemented cautious protocols that slowed production. Security officers didn't want to be blamed for missing a device, so they treated every dead rodent as a potential bomb. The Reich Security Main Office didn't want to admit they couldn't protect German industrial infrastructure from dead rats, so they issued increasingly elaborate directives that created bureaucratic nightmares. Charles Fraser Smith had weaponized German efficiency, turning their own thoroughness and attention to procedure into vulnerabilities that British intelligence could exploit with minimal ongoing effort. The ripple effects of Operation Rat Bomb extended far beyond the direct industrial targets Fraser Smith had originally envisioned. By summer of 1942, German counterintelligence had become so focused on identifying and neutralizing exploding rats that they diverted surveillance resources away from tracking actual resistance networks. Gestapo officers who should have been investigating sabotage cells and monitoring suspected Allied sympathizers were instead coordinating vermin inspections and interviewing factory workers about dead rodents. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on some German officials, whose decoded communications revealed frustration and embarrassment at having to treat rat corpses as serious security threats. But they had no choice. The explosions were real, the casualties were real, and the disruption to industrial production was measurable. Heinrich Himmler himself received reports about the rat bomb problem and demanded comprehensive solutions, which meant even more resources flowing toward a threat that consisted of perhaps 100 modified rodents distributed months earlier across an entire continent. Fraser Smith watched the German response through intelligence reports with something approaching dark satisfaction. He had created a weapon that kept working long after its physical deployment ended, a psychological virus that infected German industrial culture and replicated itself through paranoia and procedural overcorrection. The Special Operations Executive estimated that for every hour British personnel invested in creating and distributing the rat bombs, German forces spent hundreds of hours responding to the threat. The return on investment was staggering. A single workshop in London, operating with a handful of technicians and a modest budget, had forced Nazi Germany to restructure security protocols across thousands of facilities. Traditional sabotage operations required constant infiltration, constant risk, constant resupply of explosives and equipment. The rat bombs required nothing after initial deployment. They were fire-and-forget weapons in the truest sense, designed to burn themselves into German consciousness and create lasting behavioral changes that would persist for years. The British propaganda machine, always alert for opportunities to undermine German morale, eventually learned about Operation Rat Bomb through intelligence channels and recognized its potential for psychological operations. The Political Warfare Executive, which ran British propaganda efforts targeting occupied Europe and Germany itself, debated whether to publicize the exploding rats or keep them secret. The argument for secrecy was straightforward. If you don't talk about the weapon, the Germans remain uncertain about its full extent and capabilities. But the argument for publicity was equally compelling. If you publicize the weapon, you maximize its psychological impact and humiliate German security forces. The PWE ultimately chose a middle path. They didn't broadcast detailed information about the rats, but they allowed enough information to leak through neutral sources and resistance networks that rumors spread organically. Workers in German factories began hearing stories about exploding vermin, about colleagues killed by ordinary-looking rats, about security protocols that seemed ridiculous until you understood the threat. The rumors multiplied the fear far more effectively than any official announcement could have achieved. Fraser Smith himself remained almost invisible throughout the war, a condition he seemed to prefer. Unlike scientists working on radar or cryptographers at Bletchley Park, who operated in specialized facilities with clear organizational structures, Fraser Smith worked in what amounted to a commercial workshop that could have been manufacturing anything from office supplies to children's toys. His official title remained vague, something along the lines of technical advisor, that revealed nothing about his actual responsibilities. Even within SOE, only a handful of senior officers understood the full scope of Fraser Smith's projects. This invisibility served multiple purposes. It protected Fraser Smith from German intelligence efforts to identify and target key British technical personnel. It allowed him to operate without the bureaucratic oversight that often stifled innovation in military organizations. And it reflected Fraser Smith's own personality, which combined creative genius with profound humility. He didn't want recognition or glory. He wanted to solve problems that would help Britain win the war, and he measured success not in medals or promotions, but in German production delays and enemy confusion. The technical evolution of Fraser Smith's devices throughout 1942 and 1943 revealed an inventor constantly refining his craft based on field feedback. When resistance operatives reported that some rat bombs had been discovered before deployment because the stitching was too visible, Fraser Smith developed new techniques that hid the incisions more effectively. When concerns arose about the explosive mixture deteriorating during long storage periods, he worked with chemists to create more stable formulations. When German security forces began using dogs to sniff for explosives, Fraser Smith experimented with masking agents that would disguise the chemical signature. Each iteration made the devices harder to detect and more reliable in operation. But Fraser Smith also recognized diminishing returns. By late 1943, German security measures had become sophisticated enough that deploying additional rat bombs would have required increasingly risky operations with decreasing probability of success. The weapon had served its purpose. It had disrupted German industry, wasted enemy resources, and demonstrated that British intelligence could strike in unexpected ways. Fraser Smith moved on to other projects, but the legacy of Operation Rat Bomb continued influencing German industrial security for the remainder of the war. The most profound impact of Operation Rat Bomb wasn't measured in destroyed equipment or German casualties, but in the strategic disruption it caused to Nazi logistics during a critical period of the war. Throughout 1942, Hitler's forces were simultaneously fighting a massive campaign in the Soviet Union, maintaining occupation forces across Western Europe, and attempting to secure North Africa against British and American advances. This three-front war required unprecedented coordination of industrial production, railway transportation, and supply distribution. Every delay in manufacturing, every bottleneck in logistics, every hour lost to security protocols compounded across the system. When German factories in France and Belgium began implementing comprehensive rat inspection procedures, those delays rippled forward into delivery schedules. Locomotives that should have been transporting ammunition to the Eastern Front were sitting in repair facilities after boiler explosions. Factory managers who should have been optimizing production were attending security briefings about exploding vermin. The cumulative effect was impossible to quantify precisely, but British intelligence analysts studying German logistics estimated that rat bomb-related disruptions contributed to supply shortfalls that affected Wehrmacht operations during the crucial summer and autumn campaigns of 1942. Charles Fraser Smith's reputation within the Special Operations Executive grew considerably after Operation Rat Bomb, but he faced a new challenge: Success bred expectation. SOE leadership wanted more weapons like the rats, more ingenious devices that would multiply British effectiveness through psychological leverage rather than brute force. Fraser Smith found himself in a peculiar position where he was simultaneously celebrated for his creativity and pressured to repeat it on demand, as if innovation could be scheduled like factory production. He responded by expanding his workshop's scope, bringing in additional technicians and collaborating with scientists from British universities who had been recruited into war research. Together, they developed an entire catalogue of deception devices, each designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in German security thinking. There were fountain pens that concealed maps printed on rice paper, buttons that unscrewed to reveal miniature compasses, shoelaces that could be burned to produce signal flares. But Fraser Smith never quite replicated the psychological impact of the exploding rats, because that weapon had succeeded partly through its unprecedented audacity. Once German security forces learned that British intelligence could weaponize ordinary objects, they became more suspicious of everything, which paradoxically made subsequent deception operations more difficult. The relationship between Fraser Smith and the field agents who used his devices provided crucial feedback that shaped his design philosophy. SOE operatives returning from missions in occupied Europe would meet with Fraser Smith to discuss what worked and what failed. An agent might report that a particular concealment device was brilliant in theory but impractical in field conditions because it took too long to access under stress. Another might explain that German security forces had begun using a specific inspection technique that compromised certain types of hidden compartments. Fraser Smith treated these debriefing sessions as essential research, understanding that the difference between a successful mission and a captured agent often came down to small design details. He became known within SOE for his willingness to scrap entire projects if field testing revealed flaws, even after weeks of development work. This pragmatic approach earned him respect from operatives who knew their lives depended on the reliability of Fraser Smith's creations. They trusted him because he never prioritized his own ego over their safety. The exploding coal project that followed the rat bombs demonstrated Fraser Smith's ability to iterate on successful concepts. If weaponizing dead rats had worked by exploiting German disposal procedures, then weaponizing coal would work by exploiting German fuel consumption patterns. The technical challenges were different. Coal had to be genuine anthracite that would burn convincingly in a furnace until the explosive core reached detonation temperature. Fraser Smith's team developed a process for drilling out the center of coal chunks, filling the cavity with plastic explosive, and sealing it with a mixture of coal dust, tar, and adhesive that made detection nearly impossible. The finished product could pass through German hands multiple times without arousing suspicion. Resistance networks distributed the exploding coal through the same channels used for the rat bombs, targeting railway facilities and industrial heating systems. The results were similar: scattered explosions that created paranoia, security protocols that slowed operations, and German resources diverted toward inspecting millions of tons of coal for hidden explosives. Fraser Smith had discovered a formula that worked, and he exploited it ruthlessly throughout 1943. Yet Fraser Smith understood that psychological weapons had expiration dates. The more German security forces learned about British deception techniques, the more sophisticated their countermeasures became. By 1944, German bomb disposal units had developed expertise in identifying Fraser Smith's devices, and counterintelligence officers had compiled detailed catalogues of known British sabotage equipment. The game had become more difficult, requiring constant innovation just to maintain effectiveness. Fraser Smith responded by designing increasingly sophisticated devices: briefcases with triple-layer false bottoms, documents printed with invisible ink that only appeared under specific chemical treatments, miniature cameras disguised as cigarette lighters that actually produced flame and smoke to pass casual inspection. The technical complexity increased, but so did the risk. Each new device took longer to produce, required more training for agents to use properly, and created more points of potential failure. Fraser-Smith never said it explicitly, but those who worked with him sensed his awareness that the era of simple, elegant weapons like the exploding rats was ending, replaced by an arms race of technical sophistication that favored organizations with greater resources. British ingenuity was being matched by German thoroughness, and the balance was shifting. The full strategic value of Fraser-Smith's work became apparent during the preparations for D-Day in 1944. While Allied forces were planning the largest amphibious invasion in history, the Special Operations Executive was tasked with keeping German forces confused about where and when the attack would come. Fraser-Smith's devices played a crucial role in this deception campaign. Resistance networks across France used his exploding coal and other sabotage tools to attack railway infrastructure throughout occupied territory, creating the impression of widespread resistance activity that could be occurring anywhere. German commanders trying to predict Allied intentions found themselves analyzing scattered industrial sabotage incidents that revealed no clear pattern. Was the concentration of attacks in northern France evidence that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais? Or were the incidents in Normandy and Brittany more significant? The beauty of Fraser-Smith's weapons was their ambiguity. Because they could be deployed almost anywhere with minimal resources, they created noise in German intelligence assessments that obscured the actual signal of Allied preparations. Every exploding boiler, every suspicious rat, every compromised coal supply was another data point that German analysts had to consider, another potential indicator that might reveal Allied plans or might be meaningless distraction. Fraser-Smith himself knew little about the broader strategic picture. He operated on a need-to-know basis, receiving requests from SOE leadership for specific types of devices without full context about how they would be used. This compartmentalization was standard security practice, but it also meant Fraser-Smith never fully understood the impact of his work until after the war. He knew his devices were being used for sabotage operations in occupied Europe. He knew resistance fighters found them effective, but he didn't know that his exploding rats had contributed to German industrial delays that affected Wehrmacht logistics during critical campaigns. He didn't know that his concealment devices had saved dozens of agents from capture by allowing them to hide critical intelligence during Gestapo searches. He didn't know that German security forces had wasted thousands of man-hours investigating threats he had created with minimal investment. Fraser-Smith worked in isolation, solving technical puzzles without seeing the strategic chessboard where his solutions played out. This isolation probably helped him maintain focus, avoiding the paralysis that sometimes comes from understanding too much about consequences and stakes. The relationship between Fraser-Smith's workshop and the broader British intelligence apparatus revealed interesting tensions about the nature of innovation during wartime. Traditional military organizations valued standardization, reliable supply chains, and proven technologies. They wanted weapons that worked consistently, that could be mass-produced, that came with clear operational doctrines. Fraser-Smith's approach was almost the opposite. He created bespoke devices for specific situations, often in small batches, with designs that evolved constantly based on field feedback. His workshop operated more like an artist's studio than a military contractor, with Fraser-Smith personally overseeing each project and making intuitive decisions about what would work. This approach frustrated some SOE administrators who wanted more predictable output and clearer timelines. But it also produced innovations that no standardized process could have generated. The exploding rats emerged from creative experimentation, not from systematic analysis. No requirements document had specified the need for explosive-filled rodent corpses. Fraser-Smith had simply recognized an opportunity and pursued it, trusting his instincts about German psychology and industrial procedures. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France following the successful Normandy invasion, the nature of Fraser-Smith's work began shifting. The focus moved away from sabotage operations in occupied territory toward supporting intelligence gathering in Germany itself. Fraser-Smith developed miniature cameras for photographing documents, concealment devices for smuggling information across borders, and communication equipment disguised as ordinary personal items. The technical sophistication increased dramatically. Where the exploding rats had been elegant in their simplicity, these new devices required precision engineering and cutting-edge materials. Fraser Smith collaborated with specialists from British electronics firms, optical manufacturers, and chemical laboratories. His workshop became a nexus for wartime technology transfer, where academic research met practical application under pressure of military necessity. The work was intellectually stimulating but emotionally draining. Fraser Smith understood that agents carrying his devices were risking their lives in increasingly dangerous conditions as Nazi Germany faced collapse and German security forces became more brutal in their attempts to identify spies and saboteurs. The psychological toll of Fraser Smith's work manifested in subtle ways. He never met most of the agents who used his devices, never knew their names or their fates, but he knew the statistics. He knew that SOE suffered a casualty rate exceeding 50% among operatives deployed into occupied Europe. He knew that some of those casualties involved agents carrying his devices, agents who might have been captured because a concealment compartment failed or a disguise wasn't convincing enough. Fraser Smith maintained meticulous records of device performance, tracking which designs proved reliable and which ones needed improvement. But behind those technical notes was the haunting awareness that design failures could mean torture and execution for the people who trusted his work. This weight shaped his perfectionism, his obsessive attention to detail, his willingness to scrap projects that almost worked but not quite. Fraser Smith couldn't save every agent, but he could make damn sure that his devices never failed due to carelessness or insufficient testing. It was a burden he carried silently, working long hours in his workshop, while outside London still faced occasional bombing raids and the war ground toward its conclusion. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Fraser Smith faced an unexpected crisis of purpose. For nearly 6 years, his entire existence had been focused on creating devices that would help Britain defeat Nazi Germany. Every morning he woke with clear objectives: solve this technical problem, improve that concealment device, develop a new weapon that could exploit German vulnerabilities. The end of the war removed that clarity. The Special Operations Executive began winding down its operations, agents returned from the field, and the urgency that had driven Fraser Smith's workshop disappeared overnight. He found himself in a peculiar position, possessing expertise that had been invaluable during wartime, but had no obvious peacetime application. The British government classified most of his work immediately, forbidding him from discussing his wartime projects or claiming credit for his innovations. Fraser Smith returned to civilian life with a collection of memories he couldn't share and skills he couldn't advertise. He went back to manufacturing fountain pens and office supplies, the same work he had done before the war, except now he knew how to hide maps inside pen barrels and conceal compasses inside pen caps. The transition was jarring, moving from work that directly impacted the survival of nations to work that seemed trivial by comparison. The official history of the Special Operations Executive, written in the years following the war, barely mentioned Fraser Smith or his devices. The historians focused on dramatic commando raids, important sabotage operations, and the coordination of resistance movements across occupied Europe. The technical support that made those operations possible received minimal attention, treated as background logistics rather than central innovation. This historical neglect bothered some of Fraser Smith's colleagues who felt their contributions deserved recognition, but Fraser Smith himself seemed indifferent to the oversight. He had never sought fame or public acknowledgement. His satisfaction came from solving problems and knowing that his work had made a difference, even if that difference remained classified and unacknowledged. In private conversations with the few people who knew about his wartime service, Fraser Smith would occasionally mention the exploding rats, describing them with a mixture of pride and amusement. He understood that the operation sounded absurd, almost comical, when described casually. Dead rats filled with explosives seemed like something from a cartoon rather than serious military history. But he also understood that the operation had worked, that it had achieved exactly what he designed it to do, and that its success demonstrated principles about psychological warfare that remained relevant long after the specific weapons became obsolete. The broader impact of Fraser Smith's wartime innovations emerged gradually as historians and intelligence analysts began examining how the Allies had won the war. The traditional narrative focused on industrial capacity, military strategy, and technological advantages like radar and code breaking. But a more nuanced understanding recognized that victory also depended on countless small advantages that accumulated over time. Intelligence that was slightly better, logistics that were slightly more efficient, and enemy resources that were diverted toward phantom threats. Fraser Smith's devices contributed to this accumulation of small advantages. The exploding rats hadn't destroyed German industrial capacity, but they had made it less efficient. The concealment devices hadn't prevented all agent captures, but they had allowed enough agents to survive and operate that resistance networks remained functional. The deception operations hadn't fooled German intelligence completely, but they had introduced enough uncertainty that German commanders made suboptimal decisions. In total war, where both sides are pushing their capabilities to absolute limits, small advantages compound into decisive ones. Fraser Smith had understood this intuitively, designing weapons that achieved maximum impact through minimal investment. The Cold War that followed World War II created new demand for Fraser Smith's expertise. British intelligence services, reorganizing themselves for the long confrontation with the Soviet Union, recognized that the techniques Fraser Smith had pioneered during the war remained relevant for peacetime espionage. The emphasis shifted from sabotage to intelligence gathering, but the underlying principles stayed the same. Create devices that allow agents to operate covertly in hostile territory, exploit enemy assumptions and procedures, design tools that can pass inspection while concealing their true purpose. Fraser Smith consulted with various intelligence agencies throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, though the classified nature of this work meant he could never discuss it publicly. He approached Cold War projects with the same methodical creativity he had brought to wartime sabotage, understanding that the technical challenges were different, but the psychological principles remained constant. Soviet security forces, like their German predecessors, had procedures and assumptions that could be exploited by someone who understood human nature and organizational behavior. Fraser Smith lived long enough to see some of his wartime work declassified and to witness the beginning of public recognition for special operations executive activities. In the 1960s and 70s, as the British government gradually released wartime documents and former SOE personnel began publishing memoirs, Fraser Smith's name occasionally appeared in connection with technical support and device development. A few journalists interviewed him, intrigued by stories of exploding rats and fountain pens that concealed maps. Fraser Smith cooperated with these interviews, but remained modest about his contributions, always emphasizing that he had been part of a larger team effort and that his devices were only useful because brave men and women risked their lives using them in occupied territory. He deflected praise naturally, more interested in discussing the technical challenges he had solved than in claiming credit for their impact. This humility made him a poor subject for the kind of dramatic storytelling that sells books and generates headlines, which probably explains why Fraser Smith remained relatively obscure even after his work was declassified. He didn't fit the mold of the dashing spy or the heroic commando. He was an inventor who had solved problems in a workshop. And that story seemed too mundane to capture public imagination, even though his solutions had influenced the outcome of the war. Charles Fraser Smith died in 1992 at the age of 90, having lived long enough to see the Cold War end and the world transform in ways he could never have imagined in 1942, when he was stuffing explosives into dead rats. In his final years, he occasionally reflected on the strange trajectory of his life, from missionary in Morocco to inventor of weapons that killed through deception. He never expressed regret about his wartime work, but he also never romanticized it. War was necessity, not glory, and his devices had been tools designed for a specific purpose in a specific context. What seemed to satisfy him most in retrospect was the intellectual challenge, the puzzle-solving aspect of his work. How do you create a weapon that doesn't look like a weapon? How do you exploit enemy psychology to make them destroy themselves? How do you maximize impact while minimizing risk? These were fascinating problems regardless of their lethal consequences, and Fraser Smith had solved them with elegance and creativity. The exploding rats represented his purest achievement, a weapon so simple, so audacious, so perfectly calibrated to exploit German industrial culture that it continued working long after its physical deployment ended, living on through paranoia and procedural overcorrection. The historical legacy of Operation Rat Bomb extends far beyond its immediate tactical impact during World War II. Modern military theorists studying unconventional warfare and psychological operations recognize the rat bombs as an early example of what would later be called asymmetric warfare. Conflicts where weaker forces use creativity and unconventional tactics to offset the advantages of stronger opponents. The principle Fraser Smith demonstrated, that psychological disruption can be more valuable than physical destruction, became foundational to Cold War intelligence operations and remains relevant in contemporary conflicts. Special forces and intelligence agencies worldwide study Operation Rat Bomb in training courses, not because anyone would use exploding rats today, but because the operation illustrates timeless principles about exploiting enemy assumptions, weaponizing routine procedures, and achieving strategic effects through tactical creativity. Fraser Smith's intuitive understanding of how organizations function and how fear influences behavior anticipated concepts that wouldn't be formally articulated in military doctrine until decades after his death. Yet the exploding rats remain largely unknown outside specialist military and intelligence circles. When people discuss World War II innovations, they mention radar, code breaking, the atomic bomb, jet engines, and rocket technology. They don't mention dead rats filled with plastic explosive, partly because the story sounds too bizarre to be believable, and partly because its impact is harder to quantify than dramatic technological breakthroughs. You can point to Hiroshima and say the atomic bomb ended the war. You can point to decoded Enigma messages and trace specific military advantages. But how do you measure the cumulative effect of German factories running 10% slower because workers were cautious around dead vermin? How do you calculate the strategic value of thousands of man-hours wasted inspecting coal supplies? The rat bombs succeeded through diffuse persistent disruption rather than concentrated destruction, which makes their contribution harder to dramatize but no less real. Fraser Smith understood this, which is why he never bothered arguing for recognition. The work spoke for itself, even if only a handful of people could hear it. The most profound lesson from Operation Rat Bomb has nothing to do with rats or explosives. It's about the nature of innovation under pressure and the value of unconventional thinking when facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. In 1942, Britain was struggling to survive against an enemy with superior industrial capacity and military strength. Traditional approaches weren't enough. Britain needed force multipliers, ways to achieve more with less, strategies that would leverage German weaknesses rather than competing against German strengths. Fraser Smith provided exactly that, not through dramatic technological breakthroughs, but through creative exploitation of human psychology and organizational behavior. He recognized that modern industrial societies depend on trust, routine, and predictability. And he weaponized that dependence. The rats worked because they violated expectations, because they transformed ordinary objects into threats, because they made the familiar dangerous. This approach required imagination more than resources, creativity more than firepower. It demonstrated that in asymmetric conflicts, the side with less material power can still prevail if they think differently, if they refuse to fight on the enemy's terms, if they recognize that weakness can be strength when properly leveraged. The story of the British spy who used dead rats stuffed with explosives to destroy German boilers deserves to be remembered not as a quirky historical footnote, but as a masterclass in unconventional problem-solving during humanity's darkest hour. Charles Fraser Smith never commanded armies or designed wonder weapons that changed the nature of warfare. He simply looked at the problem Britain faced, understood the enemy's psychology, and created a solution so elegant in its simplicity that it continued working long after its creator moved on to other projects. The rat bombs represent the best of what human ingenuity can achieve when necessity demands innovation, and when creative minds refuse to accept that conventional approaches are the only options. In a war defined by massive battles, millions of casualties and technological innovations that reshaped civilization, a handful of dead rats filled with plastic explosive proved that sometimes the smallest, strangest weapons deliver the most lasting impact. Fraser Smith's legacy isn't the devices he created, but the mindset he embodied, that every problem has a solution if you're willing to think creatively enough, and that the most effective weapons often look nothing like weapons at all. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1942, which is why the story of Operation Rat Bomb, bizarre as it sounds, deserves to be told and retold, remembered and studied, celebrated as one of World War II's most ingenious psychological operations that history nearly forgot.